just realizing like, oh, we're doing this thing together, and we're in this together, and like we're excited to figure it out together.
That was really refreshing to be in a situation where I didn't feel like I had to pretend like I had all the answers.
There was a sense of like childlike play. Did we all just become best friends?
Hi, friends. Welcome to another Dreams of Education podcast with me, Kelly Tankley, and my friend and co-host,
Michelle Baldwin.
Michelle, today we thought we would talk about critical thinking. And specifically, we hear all the time that this is a very necessary skill. You and I deeply believe that this is a very necessary skill for kids to have. And we see so many of our models and our systems and our structures within school not really lend themselves well to critical thinking. And we were talking about how there are standout teachers that we've had in our lives. There are still standout teachers across the United States and the world that, despite the system, are very, very good at embedding critical thinking skills and teaching those through the way that they run their classrooms and just the way that they approach learning. And so we thought we'd share some of those and just kind of explore where it takes us as far as how do we really ensure that kids get this critical skill of critical thinking, and how do we make it intentional so it's not just something that happens when you have the right teacher, but it's something that happens very intentionally in every classroom.
It's so funny because there was, just for some context, there was a reporter who had been talking about executive orders and was looking at the history of how different presidents have used that. And this particular reporter, quite young, didn't know a whole lot about FDR and the New Deal. And so as this reporter was reporting, came to find out more about they're like, FDR had a lot of executive orders and this is how they were used. And people online were quite surprised that person had not learned it in school. And I was thinking back about how one of the things that we've discussed before is the unintended side effects of too much standardized testing or too many initiatives that don't think through the impact of what happens to education when you change everything. And one of those things is that history has, because it's not a standardized tested subject in many places, kind of takes a back seat to a lot of other things. And there's so much nuance in the history classes. And I was just thinking back to one of my favorite teachers was Barb Wagner. And I went to high school in Omaha, Nebraska, and Barb was a phenomenal teacher. She was a coach. She has this like indelible print on me because I remember thinking that, again, in my school, there was like a group of us that we were all considered, like these really smart kids, and we were really successful in school, and school was relatively easy for us. And so, our freshman year, we took the US and the world class, and I had a really good teacher in that. He was very passionate about history. But my junior year was the first year they had AP classes at our high school. And Ms. Wagner was my teacher for AP history. It was the first class that I was ever failing. In fact, every single kid in my class, we were all failing it. So, cue the waterworks.
The horror.
It was awful. You have straight A kids and they're in there. Yeah. We've never, ever had that happen to us before, right? So she said, I'm not failing you because you're not, good students. It's just, you're playing a game of school, and I want you to think differently. I want you to think more deeply and show me your best work. And she's like, you're kind of phoning it in. And after that kind of, reality slap, we were like, oh, okay. Well, so then we really kind of dug ourselves into the material, and the way that she engaged us in class, so much conversation. We were doing Socratic seminar before we really knew that was a thing in education, or at least we didn't as students, because this was in the mid 80s. But she really challenged us to think, not just remember dates and events and which war happened at what time. And AP American History covers this was a semester that I took. it covers a lot of ground. But one of the things that I loved about her was she would think about things thematically and help us to recognize patterns and to ask better questions so that they made a big deal about AP classes being college level material in high school. But for us, what was really the important thing is that she helped us to realize we could think. It wasn't just, again, spitting out the material that we learned. It wasn't just reading the textbook and then taking a test. She wanted to know what we thought. She wanted us to make judgment calls on the things that we were reading. She wasn't trying to get us to think like her.
Yeah.
Right. So there was a lot of evaluation happening, a lot of asking about the causes of events, not so much, okay, what was the actual date of this particular battle in the revolution? It was really the first time, I think, that I recognized, I'm sure other teachers did it, but it was the first time I recognized that they wanted more from us, from our thinking. And it wasn't just, what you see happening on standardized testing now. Our opinions mattered to her. Yeah. And because of that, I can look back now and say that made such an impact on me, not only as a student and as a human, but also in my own teaching. She's really who inspired me, I think, to be the teacher that I became.
Well, because it went beyond knowledge, just knowing the things, and it went into understanding and wrestling with all of it.
Right.
And I think, unfortunately, I did not have your history teacher. My history teachers were all about the facts and the dates and the battles and the names. And to me, it didn't occur to me until much, much later that history was stories, which seems absurd because I love story. Like I get lost in stories all the time, but I had no idea that history was about stories because for me, it was all about knowing facts, dates, people's names. There was no connection. It was not taught thematically. We were talking, I think that those were the first years that standards were being written on the like, this is the standard of what we're learning today. But I could take the test and pass the test without understanding anything about what was actually happening or why it mattered or why I should care about it.
Right.
And I think about how often we focus so much on the knowledge and we don't give enough. We also, there's no kind of help seeing how it matters to the unfolding of the world today.
Right.
When we approach it just purely from a knowledge standpoint and a memorization, what can you remember standpoint. And I think it's such a disservice when we're talking about how do we help kids really see that this learning is for them now, but also in the future. And it matters, how they're understanding and putting together their understanding of the world matters today and in the future. There was none of that in the way that I learned history. Certainly, I had those standout teachers too, of like these really incredible individuals who really kind of disrupted our thinking in the best of ways and created moments of cognitive dissonance where it created the conditions that we could really dig in and ask better questions and care about what we were learning, relate to the learning in a different way.
Well, something that you just said was about history being stories, but then also what you just said that now about relating to what we were learning, right? Okay, so if we go back to those depths of knowledge, so how often we only ask students to stay in that very lowest level where they're retelling what they learned. But when you start to think about the story and the why and the what would you do and what's your opinion about and how would you evaluate this? One of the things that I remember Miss Wagner doing was we had to think about, first of all, who was telling the history? Whose story was it? Was everyone, all their stories being told equally? How might the perspective change if someone else was telling it? Or were we reading stories about a group of people, but they weren't the ones, like that wasn't their own voice. They weren't the ones telling their stories. It was someone else. So we were being asked, again, we were, 16, 17 years old, being asked to really think through that. And I credit her for a lot of my ability to stop sometimes and say, this is the narrative that I know. What am I not hearing that I should be hearing? And she did such a great job. I remember just we had this particular textbook that was a requirement for the course, but she would give us supplemental things to read as well. And so we were able to this is, pre-internet. You couldn't just go look things up on your own. You'd either have to go to the library, or your teacher would give you these
card catalog, baby.
Right. But she gave us things like printouts for things that we would be able to read from other journals as well. And it was just, again, one of those things that I'm like, now I look back as an adult, to see how formative that was. She never told us her thoughts, her opinions of the events. She did such a good job of really helping us think through multiple perspectives that I could not have guessed what I can now as an adult, but as a kid,
Sure.
I would not have been able to know what her opinion was, because that wasn't her focus. And again, I think that there are sometimes assumptions made by people who are outside of education that teachers are just filling kids with their opinions and ideas and thoughts. And that really the best teachers that we have out there are helping kids to think, not what to think.
Right.
But to think. And how did that process, regardless of what content area you're working in, how you help kids make connections. And that, again, is just invaluable.
And how to ask critical questions, right? That's what you're describing, is how do we ask better, more critical questions so that we can really think about how we're seeing things, what information might be missing, what else connects to what we're learning, how it might impact, experiences that are happening today. So there's so much that happens in that critical questioning. And that makes me, one of my favorite teachers was my first grade teacher. And she was a brand new teacher. She was phenomenal, but Mrs. Hebert, and she was so good at immersing us in everything that we were doing that it really just transformed how we approached everything. But I remember something as simple as, like, we were all reading a class read that was a truly not very good leveled reader. It was like the story was not that compelling because it was a leveled reader. But we walked into the classroom one day and there was this entire spaceship with, glowing stars everywhere. And then there were these little purple rocks all over, made of Play-Doh, all over the classroom. And she had a tape playing of space sounds and that kind of thing. And we walked in and we were just like, oh my gosh, what's happening? Immediately we have all these questions about how did it get here and what's happened. And she's like, I don't know. It's the darnest that, we came in over the weekend and this was all here. And I don't know. And so she let us just explore and ask questions and find these rocks. And like, I wonder what this is about. And then one of us found a book that had it. This book looks like it has the same rock. Maybe we could learn about it in the book, right? So she's leading us to this idea that our environment, that books, that all of these pieces around us become the curriculum where we're learning and we can explore and ask questions and get our questions answered by the different things around us, including books. But it was such a standout experience. One, it was fun, right? But what we learned from that experience, beyond just that we were excited to read this leveled reader together, was that we could ask questions, we could get information from our environment. I mean, she was really making us think like scientists, right? Where we're kind of pulling apart and trying to understand. We see that we can get information from books, that we can learn things that impact us right now and how we're experiencing things. It was such a rich experience for really what it was, which in any other classroom probably would have just been, this is our class read and we're going to read it and then we're going to fill in the bubbles about and answer some questions. But the approach had us really starting that critical thinking process, like laying that groundwork for deeper thinking and better questions and better connections. And here I am, 40 years later, still talking about it. So clearly it made an impact.
Well, I think a part of it was that she realized that the hook in getting kids to a certain spot is curiosity, and how to keep kids curious. And like, I meet a lot of people, and as adults, I'm like, I'm always astounded when I meet someone who's not curious about everything. Right.
Right. Same.
tons of questions. And I know that's part of, when you are an educator, that is a very, welcome trait, but it's difficult for me to be able to put myself in someone else's place who's not curious about it, about a whole lot. And I'm like, well, don't you ever wonder? And then they're just like, why?
Why are you wasting your time with that?
Yeah. So
you're like, because it's interesting. It's fun.
And I'm not saying everybody needs to be like me. That's not at all what I mean. It's just kind of fascinating to me that I can tell the people who have had really strong influences in their lives, the people who have encouraged them to be curious versus people who are like, just, do what I tell you to do. Here's what you need to know. And now go do it. And there's some comfort sometimes in not being curious because it's easier in a way, right?
Well, and when you don't have to question it, I think we've talked about this before, but we do have such a culture of certainty. We love certainty. We love the answers. And I think for a lot of people, it makes them feel safe.
Yeah.
But what
agreed.
we know about curiosity is that it activates the seeking system in the brain. And that is where all of the connections can be made because it releases dopamine and all of these great things that make us interested. It creates the conditions where it makes our brains stickier and learn those things better. But it's through the curiosity. It's through again, that cognitive dissonance. It's making you like, wait, what is that? Like, that doesn't look the way I thought it would, or that wasn't what I was expecting. And it creates the conditions where you can learn. So it's so interesting that we've created this kind of culture of certainty in schools, and we kind of worship that certainty and want to, again, it's the answers. And I think it makes us feel safe I think that's why we standardize tests, like prove that this is working and that, it makes us feel good if we can see the data that says, yes, they've learned it. Unfortunately, that data can be a little bit misleading because though I could get the right answer, doesn't mean I had actually learned anything.
Well, and again, you're going back to, I only need to find the answer, but what happens when there's not a problem put in front of me that somebody already gave to me, right? So one of the things that curiosity leads you to is trying to find the problem.
How do I identify the problem?
Yes.
Yeah.
And then start looking for solutions, because that math is a perfect example of that. How many times we've seen students who, as long as you give them the problem, they're able to find a solution for the problem. Every time I've asked kids, what's your least favorite type of math problem? Like, oh, I hate, word problems. They're too hard, because you have to find the problem there.
You have to identify.
Yeah. And that's a great metaphor for a lot of learning and life, is sometimes you need to be looking for problems to solve and not just answers to problems. Because if you don't truly understand the problem, you will not be able to find a solution that works for people.
Well, and the answer isn't compelling at that point.
Right.
If you haven't identified the problem, if the problem's been given to you and your only job is to answer, that's not a compelling enough reason to learn it.
Right.
You can, it can pass through the brain, and we can regurgitate it on a test. But if it doesn't move something in you, if it doesn't change the way you see the world, if it's not helping you make new connections, there's no reason for it to stick. And so again, back to the idea of critical thinking, when we're not engaging that part of kids in the learning, activating that thinking, there's really no reason for it to go beyond the knowing.
And again, you go back to then problem solving becomes this very simplistic thing rather than the complex nature of most problems anyway. I just always I used to program databases, and I remember when I was first learning that it seemed, oh, well, this is really easy. You just do this. And then once I started to understand relational databases and the complexity there, then the solutions look different because I have a deeper understanding of what that looks like. And to just a layperson you might look at it and say, oh, well, you just do this. And I'm like, no, because you have to understand all of the relationships from table to table. And then what does that look like? And for me, again, I keep going back to metaphor, but that is a metaphor for life for me too, right?
Yeah.
Because so many of our problems that we have go back to, well, yes, on the surface, it looks like this is the issue, but if you understand some of the underlying layers, and again, when we go back into teaching and learning is a complex process. And you can't just engage one depth or one piece of how learning works. If we're only ever asking questions that deal with the who, what, where, when, I often had a poster in my classroom so that my students had a visual reminder of what kind of questions they could ask. And the beginner level of questions is the who, what, I mean, basically retell the issue, retell what I'm asking you about. And then we get a little bit more into like detective mode, and kids love to go into detective mode. It makes them feel like, ooh, there's a mystery to solve, right? And that was asking more about, okay, what happened and why. Make predictions, all of those kind of things, but that's still not into deeper levels. So once you start thinking more about judgment and evaluation and what would you do in this situation, you're really asking kids to think more deeply about every little thing that contributes to a problem or whatever it is that they're learning. And I loved having that visual on the poster because the kids could see in any of our inquiry projects, almost all of my questions are beginner questions. I'm going to go a little bit deeper. Not only did it help them learn, but they were also learning to ask better questions.
Yeah.
As they were, we'd move through the school year, beginner questions were still important. It's not that we ignored them entirely, but they knew that was a jumping off point. And that when they really got into, I just remember thinking, how many times do we ever ask kids their opinions? And how important it is to do so, because that is a learning process to form an opinion.
Yes.
And a lot of times that wasn't even being scratched.
And we can be so lazy about forming opinions where we haven't thought really about why we have the opinions we have. And what I loved about what happened in your classroom is you pushed kids not only to have an opinion, but to really think about why they hold that opinion.
Right.
And I think that's the piece that unfortunately doesn't get taught enough explicitly in schools. Sometimes it happens, incidentally, or there are other things that we do that it ends up happening. But to really explicitly teach kids how to form an opinion. And I was thinking about, we used the IB question frameworks of form, function. So form being kind of those what questions. What is it? What does it look like? How, we asked questions about function. We asked questions about perspective. Right? So whose perspective is this, thinking about it through different lenses. There's reflection. We talked a lot about the rights and responsibilities that come with knowing what we know and understanding what we understand. What are the rights and responsibilities that come with that? So that's where you're starting to get to those deeper levels of really making connections and thinking. Connections is one of them. So I liked that framework that is in the IB just because it gives you kind of a way to think through some of those depths of questions in different ways.
Well, and even asking a child, like, again, a lot of kids don't get asked their opinion, and they're not always valued because they're young. And I'm like, again, we have to help build up. It's layers and layers and layers of learning about your own opinion and why you feel the way that you do. But a lot of times when we would be reading something and I'd ask them to make a judgment call, they could talk about the word opinion and what that actually meant. But sometimes it's like, well, how are you justifying your opinion? What is it about you? What are your values that make that opinion true to who you are? And that's a harder question than just what is your opinion on this?
Yes.
So to think through.
And you're diving into one of those things that we held so closely at Anastasis, which is you have to know yourself before you can answer that question, right? You have to know enough about what your values actually are, and you have to have thought about that, which again, we did really explicitly through just the way that we structured the school so that you could get to those deeper thinking questions and that critical thinking.
And that's hard for kids to do. Again, if they don't have practice in doing it, which is why we did it. Because a lot of times, especially when they're really little, their opinions come directly from their family and their friends, which is totally fine. We get that.
Normal. Yeah.
Absolutely. And it's okay to keep that your value system based upon how your family values things. Sometimes kids break away from their families and they value things differently. And that's very hard for parents. I can say that as a parent and as a grandparent. It's really hard when your children value things differently than you do. But again, they're unique individuals. And I'm not here to control what my kids think and do. And that's kind of how I approach it as a teacher too. I'm not here to instill my values on you so much other than my value in learning and curiosity. But I do want you to be able to say, here is what I value. This is important to me, whether it's important to other people or not. And we talked a lot about how when you value things because a friend does, how that can lead you away from who you really see yourself as. And then it also changes how you think about things that you're learning. So we would talk about, we would just use an example like, what's your favorite song? That's a great place to start. Just something as simple as that. And a lot of times I would watch kids who really liked songs that the mainstream did not. They would kind of flounder on wanting to share that. And I would tell them,
that's a very vulnerable thing to do, right?
Right?
Yeah.
If you like a different style of music than everybody else in your class, that's really hard to do. So we would talk a lot about, you don't have to love every song. You don't have to like every type of music. And I was, I'm a music major. I have appreciation for all genres of music. These happen to be my favorite, but I can appreciate lots of different things of the different styles, even if I don't listen to them on a regular basis. Just giving them the freedom to talk about what they liked in those terms helped a little bit. But then we would also go back to...
I was also going to say part of that was, we go back to culture so much, but part of that was creating a culture of belonging.
Yes.
So it's hard to allow those opinions and that critical thinking and the vulnerability without creating the necessary components in your culture for that really to happen safely.
Exactly.
So I just want to point out that you did make it a safe space where kids could do that. And part of it was your own vulnerability of sharing things like that.
Well, and as you said, that was how we did things at Anastasis. The culture was we don't all have to be the exact same. And in fact, it's better that we're unique. We all learn from each other better when we don't look like little clones. Well, and I think for a lot of kids too, that peer pressure to be the same. And that is not just an American cultural thing. That is a human thing. You don't want to be the one who stands out because different makes you feel left out. So giving kids permission to really think through what that means. We would often talk about bringing this back to critical thinking. What happens when you change who you are, how you think, what you value, what you like based upon what somebody else does? And does that make you feel good or how does it feel? So they would kind of talk through those things and say, okay, now let's think about how this translates into things that we're learning, things that we understand. If my friend is telling me that the sky is green and I really value my friend, I'm going to say the sky is green because I want to make sure that I'm on the in group with my friend, not the out group. And we didn't do exercises that would purposely put kids in those places, but we would ask them to draw upon experiences that they already had. Yeah. When was a time that you can think of where you felt that a friend or someone led you into a place that you weren't comfortable, or that's something you really didn't like, but you went along with it because a friend said to? Mm-hmm. And how that affects your thinking, how it affects your self-image. And then also, do you eventually start to go along with things just because that's what everybody else is doing? So that whole peer pressure concept with kids, I'm like, how does that change what we know is true versus what we want to believe is true or what somebody else wants us to believe is true?
I think what we did really well is help kids uncover the truths of those things they were already feeling, right? They've all know what that peer pressure feels like. They all know that sometimes we do those things. I don't remember, and this could just be me not remembering, but I don't remember teachers explicitly uncovering that and talking through that. We might have heard about peer pressure, but in the 80s, it was all about drugs, don't do drugs, don't smoke. So that was kind of the context that it was given. But we didn't talk explicitly about sometimes peer pressure can look like you go along with something a friend says as if it's true, even if that's not what you're seeing.
Right.
And we do this all the time with adults. I mean, how many times do we see in like thinking fast and thinking slow, we see those cognitive biases of groupthink and how we will go with the majority, even if it's not actually what we're experiencing ourselves. And so we don't trust ourselves in that. And I love that you helped kids unpack that that's what's happening very explicitly and help them see that, so that when it came to class discussions and things that we were doing and activities that they were working on and Socratic discussions, and that they could do that critical thinking because you had kind of pulled that apart and let them see like, oh, everybody kind of experiences this. It's not something only happening to you.
I think a lot of Anastasis teachers did that. I remember watching other classes, right?
I would agree with you.
Where kids would be having these discussions and they didn't feel threatened when it came to disagreeing, right? They could say, I hear what so-and-so is saying, but I disagree because, and then they would share what it was, the information that they had, whether that was a perspective, a feeling, or different facts that they had found.
Yeah.
And that reminds me also of, we were talking earlier about facts and opinions and how we help kids learn what those are, and how so much of that has been relegated to worksheet style. Right.
I was telling you, I think I remember explicitly having a worksheet or a test or both that had a list of things on it, a list of statements, and your job was to write an S if it was a fact or an O if it was an opinion next to each one.
And again, oversimplifying something that is not simple.
Yeah.
Again, we understand that when kids are younger, you have to give them the very, foundational understanding of a fact versus an opinion. And then as they get older, you keep adding layers of complexity to that. But that you can't do that on a worksheet.
No, not well, for sure. And I think those layers of complexity and the layers of meaning that kids can gather over time are really important. And again, how are we explicitly doing that with kids and helping them build those layers of meaning where they can hold, so much of life is paradox. How do we hold two things that could both be true in different ways? And I don't think worksheets do that well. I don't think that standardized anything does that very well, holds the reality of the paradox that is just inherent in the world.
Hard agree to all of that. And it was just, everything you just said reminded me of a situation when I was teaching the K1 class. So basically 5, 6, 7-year-olds. And again, I think sometimes we don't respect kids enough to think that they can handle complex thought, right? Because one of the kids came in with a story about the Brontosaurus wasn't a real dinosaur, that scientists, a paleontologist had accidentally mixed up one part of a dinosaur with another part of the fossils, right? And I was like, oh, that's really interesting. It reminds me of something else. And I started talking about Pluto. And another kid in the class had said, oh yeah, Pluto used to be a planet, but it's not a planet anymore. And I said, I wonder, do you remember this?
I remember this because I was heartbroken on both accounts.
We were drawing Venn diagrams on the whiteboard. And I remember talking to them and saying, okay, what does it mean that Pluto isn't a planet anymore? Did it just disappear? And they kind of laughed at me and they're like, well, no, we can still see it. And I said, so what does it mean then? And so we had to go through when we have facts about certain things and definitions about certain things, when we start to learn more, we can change the definitions. And now what we know as a fact has changed because the definition is a little bit different because we have more information.
Yeah.
We have
more experiences.
Right.
We have more understanding. Yeah.
So we were talking a little bit more about how Pluto didn't technically count with the definition of what a planet is in our solar system, but now it belongs to a different definition that's a dwarf planet. So we were studying all of those things. Again, these are 5, 6, 7-year-old kids. Really,
they did it phenomenally well.
Gosh. And they asked great questions. So then we went back to the whole Brontosaurus issue, and I said, tell me how this changes facts that a brontosaurus is a dinosaur. And they were able to explain that the definition here has stayed the same, but the information changed because they noticed that parts were different. Well, then come to find out years later, they still think now that the brontosaurus was actually a dinosaur, and that there was multiple reasons. And again, I don't know all of that. I'm not a paleontology expert, obviously, but it was really fascinating again that these really young kids were asking some great questions. And we could talk about, is this a scientist's opinion or are we changing definitions? And I do remember one of the kids saying it's really hard when definitions change. Yeah. Because what happens when definitions of words change? I'm like, that happens all the time in language, yep. Right?
It sure does.
So great examples.
I'm glad that you shared that example of the youngest group, because I think so often when we think critical thinking, we automatically go straight to high school, college, older students. But you're absolutely right. Those young kids are completely capable of that deeper critical thinking, of pulling things apart, of holding those paradoxes, of having this discussion of, yeah, it is really hard when definitions change or when we get new information that changes what we thought we knew.
Right.
But I think about how important that is to cultivate at a young age, because it creates the ability for them as they're moving through to really understand the complexity and to not see our understanding of the world as fixed, but as something that's constantly evolving. I remember as a kid believing that everything that we knew, but really thinking that everything that we had already figured out, everything there was to know in science, in math, and it was just our job to learn it all now, that it had already been solved. What I love about kids going through programs like Anastasis is they know from a very young age that they're in charge of the learning being ongoing, that it's not fixed. It's not something that's already been done by somebody else. It's this, I keep saying it, but it's this unfolding that continues and that they're a part of. And I think that's really important for us to know as a society, and, just stumble on that as adults when we realize, oh, we haven't actually solved all the problems or even asked all the right questions. Because I think that it makes all of the learning that happens richer, and it makes it more connected, and it makes it more nuanced. And again, it invites that critical thinking in.
Well, and you don't feel like you've been lied to.
Yeah, right? Exactly.
So going back to Miss Wagner,
which is my outrage about Pluto, because I had to learn that as a fact, and now I have to change it in my brain, but it's already in the fixed piece. Right? Yeah.
As a kid, anytime we talked about social studies, history, or anything like that, or the formation of the United States as a country, we always learned that England was the baddies. They were the bad guys, right?
Yep.
And then I remember, as we got a little bit older and past Schoolhouse Rock, which I still love to this day, I remember, reading more and going, oh, it wasn't necessarily that they were bad. It was just they wanted to control things and we didn't want to be controlled. Then I got into that AP history class with Ms. Wagner and learned a whole lot more about all of the different nuances and how it goes beyond just the taxation without representation, right? It was more than that. And learning that there isn't necessarily always a bad guy. In some cases, there most definitely is a bad guy, right? Or a bad person, or a bad whatever mentality. However, in this particular example, I do remember I said it aloud in class. I remember that distinctly, going, oh, you know what? They weren't as bad as we were taught to believe that they were.
Yeah.
And I remember her smiling and going, tell me more, or ask, what else are you thinking here? Right. She was doing inquiry long before we really even knew that we were calling it inquiry. And it just, you feel like as you learn and things change, if that whole mindset going forward isn't about, as we acquire knowledge, we have to reorder, recategorize things, because as we learn more, we should be doing better with what we know. And I feel that
back to the rights and responsibility.
I feel like people wouldn't have such an issue with cognitive dissonance, because that's actually a good thing. Cognitive dissonance should put you in a
Great
place
thing.
of discomfort so that you can explore more. Whereas other people might think of it as, well, they just lied to me. Now I don't know what to believe.
Right.
And that is a
And I
really
think that's
hard
that
place.
problem with that culture of certainty is it
Yes.
puts us into that fixed, well, now I don't know what to do
Right.
because I've only been taught certainty and that knowledge is static and rigid and unmoving. And then, when that cognitive dissonance does get introduced, it creates a real problem because you don't know you have no framework for what to do with that.
Right. That's not it. Again, most humans don't like to feel discomfort. We know that. We also know that often the discomfort, the struggle is part of the learning process, and it means that your brain is doing what it's supposed to be doing. But at the same time, how to help, like, as a teacher, helping students through that discomfort, saying, yes, you're frustrated right now. I'm here to help you through that. You are going to get through it, and you're going to get to a place where it's like, oh, epiphany, awesome, right? I understand this better. That's a good thing.
Well, it also leaves you open to new layers of meaning.
Right.
Where when you are so stuck in that certainty culture, there is no reason for a new layer of meaning because you already arrived at it.
Right.
And so I think about how hard that was for some of our students to learn, and even how hard that was for me going into college, where I did have, professors and people who were pushing the boundaries of my thinking in uncomfortable ways that made me reevaluate what I understand and what I know. And it was uncomfortable. It was hard at first because it wasn't something that, was cultivated all the way along in every class that I had. And that critical thinking can be a vulnerable act as well, because it's putting you in a place where you have to admit, I maybe don't know it all, or I don't understand it all.
It's more work.
It is more work. This is true.
I go back to, like, okay, I'll listen to, like, a news item. Either I'm hearing it or I'm reading it on my phone, and that means I have to do my own due diligence is this coming from a reputable source? Can I find multiple instances of this from, again, trusted sources? What perspective am I being told? How is this being shared?
Yeah.
Even something as simple, like I was sharing with you earlier, I was out of town and had to get on a plane the same night that a plane in Toronto was flipped over. And people were kind of losing their minds about this and why it happened, and kind of going into conspiracy theory thinking. And I'm like, okay, let's slow that down. And look at
Take a deep breath, pause.
Right. And what I knew about Toronto, and again, because I do have some friends who live in that area, but they were saying they had some really strong storms and some very strong gusts of wind. I'm also married to someone who used to be an air traffic controller, and he said that happens actually quite often when there are extreme storms and a plane lands and then turns to go to the jetway. That moment of when they're turning against the wind is an opportunity for that to happen. So again, it's not people were doing their jobs. This wasn't because, it was just a really fascinating time to experience, again, because I was getting on a plane a few hours later, but to experience that news in a way that I wanted just to read it and know, and not have to do extra work.
Tell me
right?
I'm going to be okay.
Yes, because the fear in me was, I want some certainty. Yeah. But at the same time, I was like, no, I know I've got to dig a little deeper here. And I'm not going to say that people are lazy. I don't think that's the case. I think sometimes we have been forced to be complacent because we have things delivered to us so often. And that's
we are in an age of information overload kind of all the time.
Yes.
And it's like, how do you sort through all that? How do you give equal critical thinking to all of the information that's like fire hosed at us all the time? So it does, there is a piece of it as an adult too, of how do you filter what is coming in so that you can think critically about it as well, because it is too hard. If you're scrolling through Blue Sky or you're scrolling through something where you're getting new information and new thoughts every second.
Right.
That's going to be hard to critically think about all of it, and to really do due diligence on every single thing. So it's like, how do you filter down what you're allowing in so that you can do that? And I think that's a skill that can start to be taught young. I don't think kids maybe experience that specific aspect of things the same way, at least as a practice in schools where they're
Right.
getting so much information so quickly that they can't do it. But
Well, that just reminds me of things that we've talked about quite often on this podcast, is that if we only view education and learning as the filling of a receptacle, that we do such a disservice, because then we are creating people who can only take time to believe what they're told or what they read, instead of also taking a step back and saying, okay, what perspective is this? Who's telling the story? What other facts are being left out? What extra information is in here to make me feel a certain way? And all of that, again, when you don't allow kids, I think about the classes of some of our students that they've come in and they've said, we're not allowed to ask questions. Right?
Yep.
I remember being very, very few and far between, but I did have a couple of classes growing up where we weren't allowed to ask questions. We just had to sit and be quiet and do what we were told. And then the contrast of having such other great teachers, not only did I at that time realize that my favorite teachers were my favorite teachers because they were good, but also because they engaged me as a human and as a learner, not just as someone to sit and do as you're told. When we only allow for kids to sit, be compliant, they don't get to practice that skill of thinking for themselves. There are a lot of people who will say that that's intentional. I'm not so cynical that I believe that that's true in every case, but we can look at that and say, I want better for our kids. I want better for all kids so that they all can reach their true potential. And again, you don't take things on face value, because nothing is as simple as what face value is. Nothing is.
No. And we even have so much imagery to remind us of this, and we still get it wrong all the time. I think about like the elephant, right? And everybody's describing a different part of the elephant, or Khalil Gibran and the prophet, like, or, there's so many pieces that we have these metaphors. We have seen these images. We have this in the zeitgeist of like what exists and what we know about. And yet we still are so poor at it in real time. And I think some of that, unfortunately, has come through the system of education, how we do school and education. And so when we talk about critical thinking, you can kind of pull apart the pieces of critical thinking, but how are we embedding it so that creating the conditions, like we said, if it is a vulnerable act. And so how do we create the conditions that are necessary for that to happen? And I don't think we look at all of the pieces that impact critical thinking in the classroom. It's almost like this bolt on, right?
It reminds me too of like just the way that reading is taught in a lot of places. And we've harped on reading a whole bunch in many episodes. First of all, kids, when they learn to read, and when they have choice, when they get to choose the books that they want to read, they have a lot of options of things to read in a well-stocked library. They get a lot of perspectives just from there, because they're reading and they're creating the worlds in their heads as they're reading, and through their imagination, they're able to hear different stories, right? It's, one of the reasons that we really think through what kind of books do we have in our libraries, what stories are being told, who's telling the stories, all of those. I think
because it can be a mirror, but it can also be a window, right?
Exactly.
And
we need some doors.
Enough of those windows and doors. Yeah.
Yes. So I think now, okay, if I only relegate reading class to what's in the textbook, the excerpts that are in the textbook, or a paragraph that I'm having you read so that you can tell me what the main idea of the paragraph is, the focus on allowing the brain to take all of the information in from the book and get through from page to page, chapter to chapter, through the whole plot and all of the different things and the conflicts that arise. If you're only taking a piece of that book out and now teaching a kid to read off of some paragraphs or some excerpts, critical thinking doesn't get engaged, because
nowhere in there.
Right, because right now we're reading for a very specific purpose. that's not to say that we shouldn't teach kids to read for different purposes. We actually should, and that's so important. You should be able to read for pleasure and leisure, but you should also be able to read for, information gathering. I should learn how to skim to look for a specific detail. There are lots of purposes for reading. When we only do that in the science part of reading, we completely lose the ability for kids to go through and make their own judgment on what they're reading. Because right now it's just, what does the teacher want me to do?
Right. And it loses all of the critical thinking components that could be embedded in that experience.
It could even be, I hate this book. I don't like this character. I remember reading Gone Girl was the book I read. I was like, I hate every character in this book. Absolutely hate it. But the book was compelling enough for me to keep reading it, even though I had a strong dislike of the characters.
Yeah.
Because I wanted to know what happened next. And throughout the whole thing, I have all of these judgments happening, right? And predictions and evaluation of what I thought of the book and the end of the writing. And that's an important piece too. I mean, again, you're teaching kids how to think through what they believe, what they value. Do I identify with this character, or do I think they're the most, horrible person on the planet? I mean, all of those things are good, and we want kids to be able to do that.
That made me think about some of our favorite tools that we used at Anastasis that really helped with the critical thinking, helped us hone that skill with our students. And the first one that came to mind is a book that we used with the junior high called Reading, Writing, and Rising Up. And I have to look up who put that out, but phenomenal piece, because she put so many lessons in. Are you looking it up for me? Thank you. She put so many lessons in that are all about critical thinking. They're all about considering things from multiple perspectives, helping hone those skills. And we often we never used curriculum ever. And then I asterisk it, because if you consider this curriculum, we used it every year because it was so brilliant. Did you?
Linda Christensen? Yeah, Linda Christensen.
Linda Christensen. Thank you. I don't know why that didn't come to mind.
I was like, I think I probably have it back here somewhere.
Yes, it is. It is one of those that every single activity, lesson, reading component, writing component has critical thinking so deeply embedded. One of the lessons in there has kids watching different cartoons and historical, like going back through different cartoons and really pulling apart who's telling the story, who's represented, who's depicted as the bad guy, who's the hero. And it really helped kids to start to look with more depth and notice things that they wouldn't have noticed before, and start to unpack narratives that they wouldn't have, that, you kind of just take for granted as this is just normal. This is what a cartoon is. But they started to notice, like, the bad characters are always dark. Interesting, right? Women always need saving. Interesting. Like there were all these pieces that they really started to pull out. And what ended up happening after they would do that lesson is, in everything they did, they would start to see those different perspectives. They would start to think with that more critical lens that they learned through that activity and lesson. Can't speak highly enough about that one for intermediate, junior high, like 5 through, I think through high school could use it, but definitely like 5th grade up. Had such a good time with those lessons, and really they're inquiry based, but the way she sets them up are truly lovely.
There was an exhibit at the Denver Museum, the art museum, that our kids went through one time when I was taking them on a trip, and it was about media and perspectives in media. So something very similar. So a lot of times, it's we can give kids only so much within the classroom, but taking them out into experience things that they wouldn't necessarily normally encounter. Also, and then again, asking questions. And it does remind me, like, I know that there are sometimes, not just us, but in education, we have a little bit of pushback that I don't want my kid asking all these questions. And I'll give you a personal example. When I was in college, I took a class called Religious Inquiry. It was a Methodist college, so there was already the expectation that you were going to be going into this with kind of that mind frame or mindset, right? But what I loved about the class wasn't about questioning what I was necessarily brought up to believe so much as question everything. And how the professor was also a minister at one of the churches in downtown Lincoln, Nebraska. But the way that he asked us to question went back to, this is what you were taught to believe. How do you feel right now? What if we ask questions? What if we talk all together and share our own experiences? Now, what do you think? It wasn't, again, he didn't tell us to stop believing or to start believing or any of that. It was just ask a bunch of questions. And I do remember my mom was a little nervous. She says, it makes me worry that you're asking all of these questions. And I was puzzled by that. I was like, okay, why? And she goes, well, then maybe you won't believe what I believe. And I was like, oh, okay. I'm like, well, okay. Yeah. So sometimes I think that's a religious and a faith kind of mindset, but I think sometimes it is hard for adults to place their trust in educators and worry that their kids are going to come home thinking differently. And then worried about that. And I always like to think that when I had, as a teacher, I was talking to kids and to parents, I reminded parents that I'm here to support you. I'm also here to help your kid ask questions and to learn. If there is some rub there, that's something that we can address together. So I'm not out to, turn your kids against you or anything like that, right?
I think the fear is indoctrination, right?
Yes.
Maybe
exactly.
You're going to indoctrinate them in a way that is not what I believe. And so I got to hold tight to what, and we saw that being a faith-based school, we saw that in the realm of religion and faith. And it always struck me as so interesting because Jesus does nothing but ask questions and tell parables. And here we are so afraid of the question. So yeah, we definitely understood that. But to your point, that we're not trying, any educator, I don't believe, unless they have a nefarious kind of direction that they're going, it's not trying to indoctrinate. It's how do we create kids who can learn and think, right?
Yeah. And I've always made the argument that more information is not a bad thing. Right? The more information I have, the better suited I am to make a decision that is based upon my values. And again, if my values differ from you, then that's a different situation. But more information is always a good thing when that information can be trusted. I have to say that because as I'm saying all of these things, I'm like,
as you're speaking.
Sometimes more information is overwhelming and then it does the opposite and it makes me just want to shut down. So when I look at the information I had growing up versus information that kids have access to now, two completely different things.
Yes. Which to me, makes critical thinking more necessary than ever, because the amount of information flooding in by, people that they look up to or, are influencers or for whatever reason is so much greater than anything you and I encountered. That to live in a culture of certainty when there's so much information just being flooded to them all the time, to me is dangerous. Because if I trust everyone who looks like they know what they're talking about, like it leads me to eat Tide Pods. You know what I mean? Like there's real consequences to kids not being taught how to critically think from a young age and consider what they're seeing and ask good questions and really dig in.
Well, and just the amount of misinformation and disinformation, intentionally misinforming people, that is something that, again, we had such high hopes when the internet was something that was available to everyone and thinking, oh my gosh, we could use this for such great things. And instead,
so much good could happen.
In some places has become just, a streaming pile of garbage constantly. But again, as you said, that means critical thinking is that much more important, and how to help kids to parse through all of that, to say, okay, if something instantly triggers your emotions, that is a sign that something's trying to get you to act, whether that's manipulation or it's something that's trying to help you say, hey, you value this, you need to really act on this. So, a lot of times we would talk in class about when I was teaching, if something makes you angry or afraid when you read it, that's somewhere where you need to stop, take a breath, and say, okay, what's the purpose behind this? Why is someone trying to make me angry or afraid? Is it to help someone else, or is it just to keep me angry and afraid? And then we would look at examples of that, or even just, advertising. Kids are remarkably astute when it comes to advertising if you call their attention to it. So, again, we talk about all of these foods that are marketed to you and your parents as healthy, and are they really healthy? So we go look on the labels. They're like, oh my gosh, the first ingredient is sugar. That can't be healthy. And so I would say, okay, why do you think it's being marketed
34
that way?
grams and we're starting our day with it.
But then I would say, okay, well, why is it being advertised as healthy? And so we would watch a commercial again, or read like an ad, and they would say, okay, well, there's a mom and she's the one doing all the talking and she's smiling and she's making breakfast for her kids. So I said, so who's this commercial for? And they're like, well, it's for moms. And I said, okay. And they're like, well, moms want to be healthy. So that's why they use the word healthy. It was, again, really interesting to hear kids' perspectives.
Part of the balanced breakfast, Michelle, right. As part of a balanced breakfast.
Which means, but again, if you help kids think through that, you ask them the questions, they can recognize it. Mm-hmm. And then my favorite is like, oh, they're lying to us. I'm like, oh, okay. So advertising. So what's really the point? Well, they're like, well, yeah, they just want us to buy their stuff. I'm like, okay, great. We know that. Now, where can we put this into an ad that's targeting kids? And they would look at toy commercials or ads and things like that. And then they start to realize, oh, just because somebody says something or writes something doesn't mean that it's actually true. And that's the part for kids where you have to kind of help them to see that advertising doesn't have to be 100% factual. They can say certain things within limits, but that the feeling of truth sometimes is not actually truth. Yeah. And again, when kids are able to take a break and question that, right, they can that might not be true. That is a great step forward into having them think about things rather than just to accept it and, oh, that must be the case because someone told me that's the way it was.
Yeah. Another tool we loved was the logical fallacies.
Yes.
And the logical fallacies, if you've not seen it, there's posters. There's also cognitive bias posters. And I'm trying to remember who, because there's different, yourlogicalfallacy.com is where you can find it. And then there's also the cognitive biases, and it's at your biases.is. And they're so brilliant. We had these posters up. There's also card sets. What I love about it, they put a Creative Commons license on it so that you can download all of it for free. They have the same things that you can purchase. So if you don't want to print out cards and cut them up, you can purchase them. But we use those all the time as we were in inquiry blocks, and we would just pull out those cards or point to the poster and which cognitive bias is represented here, or which logical fallacy is represented here, and really have the kids kind of understand what that looks like and pull them apart so that when they were having Socratic discussions or debates, and they could identify these different fallacies and biases with each other. But then, as they're watching clips of news programs, or as they're reading maybe an article that came from an op-ed, they could really start to understand what was being used in those articles or in that media, and think better, have more depth of thought about what was actually happening, how much it could be trusted based on what was it. And it led to such better discussions in the classroom. Right. And we mostly use those with the oldest kids, with the intermediate and junior high. I don't know that we used it as much with the younger.
I think one resource
the principles we used with the younger, but I don't know if the actual resources.
There was the correlation and causation graphs that I can't remember the website, but I'll have to find that so we can put it in the show notes, where we would show kids correlation graphs and causation graphs.
Yeah.
And just show, let's say, okay, so, for example, if is an overabundance of, deer in your neighborhood at the same time that everybody has chicken pox, does that mean that deer cause chicken pox? And they were looking at it, they're like, well, no, that doesn't make any sense. I'm like, okay, but if I look at it, they're the same. So we could talk about the difference between what's a causation versus correlation, and how correlation is more about coincidence, and we just happen to notice these things at the same time. And that, I'm telling you, that activity, I remember being pretty impactful, not just for the kids, but also they were going home and talking about it. And I think about, there's a lot of medical misinformation in the world, and how sometimes correlation gets a lot more attention and loud voices versus actual causation, or studies that have disproved things, but because they don't get a lot of noise, the misinformation is louder, and that's what sticks in people's heads. And it's not just because they're susceptible and they're believing it. It's more about, that's just what you keep hearing all the time. It's really, it's like the whole reason why we have campaign signs, right? We want to see people's names, because for the people who don't, do a lot of research on a political candidate, if they see a name, that's what sticks in their head. It's the same thing with all of these studies, that if I put out as much bad information as I possibly can, and I'm louder, it's why a lot of celebrities say there's no such thing as negative press, right? They just, it's all good. Helping kids to really see that. And again, asking a lot of questions. What do you notice? What do you wonder? What can we take away from what we've seen here? I really do believe that we just don't give kids enough credit for what they can learn with the appropriate questions.
Yeah. And, so interesting starting an inquiry-based school. Mm-hmm. And obviously I started it for kids, but the amount that I think all of us got out of teaching in that environment, because it did cause us to also question our practices and look very deeply at why we were doing things, how we were approaching things, the way. And so the kids learned a ton, but I also, they changed, but I changed kind of thing. Same. There's so much about my own approach to learning and thinking and understanding that changed so much as a result of the metacognition that happened for us as we thought about how do we help kids think really critically? How do we help them ask better questions? How do we get them to understanding if we're not just delivering information? It changed so much about how I see and approach the world. I mean, purely the different perspective things that we did with kids completely changed how I approached all of it.
Well, the vulnerability that was important for us as teachers to go into every single time, like, I don't know everything about this. I'm going to be learning some of these things with you. Again, as teachers, we had a pretty good fundamental understanding of a lot of different concepts, but what kind of things did we need to ensure that these things are important for us to know? I'm going to make sure you understand it, but also what happens when we don't know? And showing the kids and being right next to them saying, hey, we're learning this together. It helps them understand, again, kind of like that growth mindset about learning, but also practicing critical thinking activities in front of them and being able to say in real time, I used to think this, but now I understand this better. Or I used to think this because this was the only story I was ever told, but I'm hearing from lots of different types of people now, and I have a better understanding because I've heard from more voices. And how important that was, again, to model in front of them. It wasn't always intentional modeling. A lot of time it was just in time. Well, I don't see that.
I can't overstate how much vulnerability plays into critical thinking, because as I'm thinking about the process that we did with students and the activities and things that they engaged, there was so much of that vulnerability that just surfaced that I don't know we could have done as well if we didn't have a culture that started in belonging, started with kids really understanding their own values. I think it would have been a much steeper climb for us to try and get them to those higher levels of thinking and kind of pulling things apart and willingness to engage other people's perspectives. And so much of that happened through, we took kids on field trips all the time. Like you were saying, those perspectives that they were encountering, they could do from a different place of honoring those perspectives because of the critical thinking work we had done at school.
Right.
And so it was kind of this cyclical experience that they were having that was feeding the critical thinking in some ways, where they were hearing outside perspectives, but they were able to engage those and honor those because of the work that had been done at school. And then those perspectives came back and informed the work we could do next time, right? So it was kind of the cyclical thing.
It makes me think about thinking about expertise, right? Mm-hmm. Anybody who's an expert in any field will by default tell you, if they're a true expert, that they don't know everything. There's a lot of learning left to be done. And they'll say, anybody who is so certain that they are at the end limit of their understanding is obviously, they're incorrect, and they're definitely not the person you want to be talking to about that. So it makes me think too, okay, when I look at expertise in a way of from a critical thinking perspective, it is, I know these things and I am well versed in them and I'm viewed in my field as an expert. However, I'm continually learning. That lifelong learner, continuous learning, however you want to call that piece of it is so vital that to ignore it and say, well, I'm the expert, you should just trust me. That part is where, again, for me, that's when my hackles rise up a little bit. And I'm like, okay, I don't know that I'm going to trust you because you are so certain that you know everything. Right?
And I was just thinking how much schools really need to embrace critical thinking as a standpoint for us too, of not assuming we know everything about how a child learns, that we're willing to not be the experts. We're willing to continue asking questions, continue kind of diving down, so that we don't just take on a practice that is a garbage practice because the new experts say that this is what works. And I think that a lot of what has happened that is less than ideal in education has come about because we are relying too much on outside experts to tell us what it should look like. And we're not paying attention and thinking critically about our own communities and then working within our own communities, adapting based on what we're seeing in real time. So I think the critical thinking even extends to how are we approaching the from an educator standpoint, the learning and what's happening.
Just even thinking about the difference of child development and brain development, things that we've learned since I became a teacher in the early 90s versus now, and how much more we understand trauma response and what happens to a child's brain if they are they live in an area where they don't have access to quality nutrition.
Yeah.
All of the different things, right?
Or live in a very nice neighborhood and are not accessing quality nutrition. You know what I mean? How many kids do we know that would refuse to eat any amount of protein? Because it was all, the chips and candy was what they would eat. And so that's what they ate. But learned so much about all of those pieces that have changed and evolved. Our understanding has evolved, might be a better way to say that.
But that's, again, part of being an educator, is knowing that that my understanding of where I am right now continues to grow because that is the choice I'm making. Part of being a critical thinker is also knowing that I still have so much more to learn. Yes, I can look at that there are things that I have expertise in, but I'm always going to be moving that forward because there's no endpoint for me here.
It's the willingness to hold it all loosely and not so tightly that I know it and you can't take it, right? It's the willingness to hold it loosely and say, there might be more here for me. There might be new information that changes how I think. There might be a new perspective that I am exposed to that changes my thinking. And all of that, I think, is so critically important for us as educators if we're going to create an environment where we encourage critical thinking for the kids.
Right. Well, and again, we mention vulnerability all the time, But there has to be, it's funny because I think of that as the more secure I felt about myself, the more willing I am to be vulnerable. And I think, again, for people who see vulnerability as a weakness, you have it exactly backwards. Vulnerability is a strength, being able to show and share that vulnerability. And I think, especially as a young teacher, I'm not sure where the feeling came from, but like I had to know it. I had to like feel like I had all the answers.
Yeah,
Otherwise,
I had that same feeling.
right? And the more I knew, the more I was willing to say, I don't know that. Versus back then, I would not have said, I shouldn't say never, but back then I was very unlikely to say that I didn't know something because, for me, I was, 4 and 5 years older than most of my students at the time. But again, that was kind of how I was taught to teach. Be the adult, be certain. And those were,
and at least for me, how many years of education was I exposed to where the teacher was the holder of all the answers?
Yeah. Yeah.
So I'm going to let us off the hook a little bit because we were indoctrinated in the certainty for a lot of years as well.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think that there's a desire from a lot of people, especially in times when the uncertainty around them creates a sense of fear. And whether that is, financial, or it's about jobs, or about the state of the world, when you feel uncertain, you want something or someone to provide certainty for you to help kind of ease that. And I look at that and say, okay, I understand it. I understand the whole mentality regarding that. When again, my defense mechanism goes up when I hear someone tell me that they have all the answers, because that's just not the case.
Well, and I think all the time about the world and all of its complexity and the problems that we have and the rate of change of technology and just what's happened in the world. It needs people who will continue to ask the questions, who will continue to hold it loosely and look for other ways of thinking about the problems. Because I think if we stay so in the rut of our current thinking of the certainty, that's where we get into trouble, because we can't adapt, we can't change, we can't evolve, we can't ask better questions because we're stuck with, we already know the answer. And so I think about, it's such a mismatch, but you're right. The uncertainty creates this craving of certainty. And so it's this funny cycle that doesn't serve any of us very well.
I'm going to use this as an example, and I think I can make it work. So bear with me. So the gentle parenting movement, right? There are a lot of, especially influencers, but a lot of child psychologists also, who are like, this is if they're teaching about love and logic, for example, which is the name of a course also. I'm not trying to conflate the two. You can't always reason with a child whose brain has not developed to a place where they have logic and reasoning as a fully developed skill set. So I think, again, okay, if I'm talking to a toddler, I can't tell them to stop hitting me because it hurts.
Yeah.
I can't stop telling them to hitting me because it's wrong, because that's not computing yet. I'm also not going to hit that child because now I'm doing the exact same thing that the child did to me. I'm not going to yell at that child because that child is already dysregulated, or else that child would not be hitting. So when I look at the whole philosophy of gentle parenting, it is meeting children where they are, helping them to move from dysregulated to regulated, and then giving different options so that the next time that they are in a place of dysregulation, they can make a choice. It's not going to necessarily be based on logic because they don't have that capacity yet. Moving forward into, again, an elementary school or junior high or high school, looking again at child development and brain development, there are a lot of places where we have taken kids who are dysregulated and just punished them. We didn't work through the dysregulation with them. So now all they know is when they're hurting or suffering or something is wrong, that they're going to get punished for acting out. They don't have any way of necessarily resolving or moving to regulation. There's a critical thinking piece in here. And it's
Absolutely.
something that is taught and learned, not explicitly, but by actions.
Yep.
So when I'm looking through, we've been talking a lot about critical thinking and how we deal academically, how we talk to kids, how we ask questions. But now I'm going to move a little bit into also critical thinking as an action skill.
Yep.
Because and that's where my brain went to straight to gentle parenting, because there are a lot of folks who don't believe. They think it's, letting kids off the hook, or it's allowing them to have bad behavior and condoning what's happening, rather than thinking through, we have more information now about why kids act out. We have more information about how to parent or how to use discipline in a way that actually changes the behavior. And in doing so, you're also helping the child. Not only does the behavior change, but their understanding of their own behavior changes.
I was going to say that the cognition around those behaviors is more true.
Right.
They understand it more. Yeah.
I mean, the number of times I heard a kid like kind of losing it and they're going, I think I just need a break. And I'm like, oh, okay.
I might need a snack.
To be a 7-year-old kid saying that to an adult going, I think I just need a break. And you're like, okay, what kind of break are we looking at here? Are we looking for like a 30-second break, or do you need to go down and talk to Mrs. Tinkley in the office? What's that look like? And being able to advocate for themselves, but because they were able to recognize in themselves their own basic needs.
Yeah. I mean, you're helping me remember how much critical thinking was just part of our culture.
Yeah.
And I love that you pointed out it wasn't just academic. It's not just academic. It's also social, emotional. It's all these other components as well that really benefit from that critical thinking. And I think about how often as adults are the one we take that critical thinking ability away from kids through the ways that we design our support systems for behavior things.
Right.
And so kids are never invited to think critically about what's happening in their bodies and how that looks and what's going on. And so you're right, they never learn how to regulate because we've taken the ability for them to think about that out. And that is something I'm proud of that we did really well, is help kids really think about why they're feeling certain ways, what that what that feeling might be indicating, how behaviors would play out, and how they could fix it, how they could repair. So much of that repair was thinking critically about what had happened and what needs to follow.
Right. Well, and it's, again, a lot of the pushback on gentle parenting and the style of, I don't even like the word discipline because it has such a negative connotation.
It's really restorative justice is really
what
we're teaching. Yeah. How
the pushback is always, oh, you're being too soft on kids. They'll never learn. You just let them get by with anything. And that's so opposite of actually what's happening.
Well, and if anybody actually goes into those classrooms where that is the lived experience, and then they're like, how do you get the kids to be so polite? And you're like, well, because we're not, because we're actually teaching the underlying skills and helping them understand what that does to a community.
Emotional regulation, even just recognizing what your emotional state, that there are times as, a 56-year-old person, I sit here and go, how am I feeling right now? I don't have a word for it because I have to stop and think.
Yeah.
Whereas if I were
where is
always
dysregulation coming from, and why is it happening?
And honestly, I wish that more adults would take the time to do that, because I think like the airport, just because that's where I was recently.
Yeah.
What an experience it is to be around, thousands and thousands of impatient and angry people.
Yep.
And to stop and think, well, we're all stressed out. Let's, give each other some grace. That could be a good thing, right? But looking back again in the classroom, helping kids have language for that, the terminology, and to be able to describe where they are as a practice, so that when they were feeling dysregulated, they had some language to be able to explain that. And then we could either talk one-on-one to get through that. They could involve their classmates if they wanted to, or they could recognize this is a bigger issue. It didn't mean that we would condone behaviors that were unacceptable in society. We had no non-negotiables, and the kids knew those up front. And there were consequences for going past those non-negotiables. However, there was still always a conversation. We had to be able to dialogue with kids about, here's what happened, here's what you chose to do. Talk to us about this. Think through what you could have done
and sometimes
better.
it led to a loss of privileges until we can earn that trust back, right?
Exactly.
So,
yeah. It wasn't at all being soft on kids. And I can sit here too and say I wasn't always perfect at doing this. There were times when I was reactive and then would have to go back to kids and say, yeah, sorry. I kind of,
right?
Yeah, right. I got very upset and frustrated and I kind of hollered instead of having a conversation with you. I'm also a human. I also make mistakes. But being able to talk about that and again, sharing with the kids, you know what? I didn't eat enough protein this morning. My brain I'm hangry. Sorry. And, we would have a lot of jokes about being hangry, but all of that is, again, another practice into thinking critically about who we are, how we interact with each other, how our actions have impact on other people, whether it's positive, negative, or anything in between, and how when you're in community, those are things that we need to be thinking about constantly, because it's not just about me and my individual rights and what I need. It has to be, I'm in a room with all of these other people. Everything that I do and say can potentially impact the people in this room. Mm-hmm. How does that look when we need to be members of a thriving community? And how are we responsible to and for each other?
Yeah. All of it is critical thinking.
It's so funny how we were like thinking about how we were going to talk about this particular topic today and going back into like everything we do.
Everything. Yep.
It's all connected. We could not do inquiry learning without also thinking about critical thinking. We could not do that without having space for social emotional learning.
Yep.
We had to have
belonging and identity.
All of those things. Yeah.
Yeah.
Everything that we've talked about in every podcast episode, they're all interconnected. And if you took one piece out, then we could not have done the other things as well as we did.
It's just, we have to pay attention to all of it because it all works together. I think that's one of the saddest things to me is seeing, when just one piece is tweaked. We talked about that in the Nathan Hale episode of trying to scale the wrong thing without looking at all the components that really make it work. And I think about that, when schools say that we want to increase critical thinking, but then they're not changing the structures that make that possible. They're just trying to do this one piece and then we're surprised when it doesn't work. I don't know. It just seems obvious once you've been in it and once you've seen it. But I know that it can feel really daunting to schools of like, where do I start with that?
Yeah, I mean, and I look at it too as it always comes back down to respecting the individual.
Always starts with the relationship with the actual student in front of us.
And not making assumptions of what they're capable or incapable of doing. Right. And we already talked about, we were able to do a lot of these activities with very young, with 5-year-olds, helping them to really think through and question and wonder and notice. And
I think too, knowing the community you're in, because you touched on it, like if the community you're in is fearful about kids learning some of these skills, to understand really what is driving that fear and that narrative so that you can address that and partner differently, I think is such a big component too. And that's a piece that's often left out of the conversation is like, not only do we have to know the kids in our care for that critical thinking, but we also have to know who are the other players and how are they thinking about this to really do it well for each community. And what the fears in our community could be different from the fears, in a community in Denver. So I think all of that is so important to pay attention to. And again, I don't know that we're intentional enough about all the pieces when we think about critical thinking in schools. I don't know that we're intentional enough about all of what makes that possible.
Yeah. So, like as we started, I'm just grateful that I had teachers growing up that really encouraged me to always question, always be curious, that learning is a joyful thing and something that you'll want to do your whole life. So what are you going to do to put pieces in place so that that can happen? It doesn't mean that you have to enroll in a college or university class for the rest of your life. That's very costly, and that doesn't equate to learning. There are lots of ways to be a curious person that you can do for free.
I do think it's unfortunate that we have the mindset that critical thinking can only happen in higher ed or secondary ed, because it really can start at the youngest ages, as my illustration of when mine started, and just what we saw at Anastasis. Those kids are so capable of thinking at really high levels and understanding and holding the nuance and the paradox of the way the world works.
And it wasn't just us noticing that, nor was it just their parents. When we would take them on trips, whether it was service learning or field trips, every single time they were just like, your kids ask the best questions every time.
And they notice things that no other group notices.
Yeah.
Really cool. Well, I think we did it. I think we answered it for today. So we'll just
solved all
onward.
the problems today. Onward.
Yeah. Hey, Michelle, where else can people find you online?
I blog at avenue4learning.com, and the 4 is the actual number 4, not the word 4, avenue4learning.com.
And you can find me at dreamsofeducation.wordpress.com, which is my original blog. You can also find me at ktsplace.com, which is where I share a bunch of resources and kind of projects that we're currently working on. And we are both on Blue Sky at the moment, but not as active as we once were on our favorite bird. Come find us and connect with us in other places, and we look forward to connecting with you.
Education.